Welcome into the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show. I'm your host, Alfredo Brown, joined as always by Dave Kluge. And today we are talking about our tight end rankings and telling you guys which tight ends you need to be drafting. There's not a whole lot of great ones out there. It's a little bit flatter than years before, where there's a lot of tight ends who could finish as the overall tight end one. So we're going to break this down, going through our rankings and how they compare to average draft position, break those guys up into tiers, and well, we're going to be able to tell you who you should be targeting. Dave, let's jump into our first tier here.
Yeah.
Tight end one, we've got Travis Kelce. You and I both have him as our number one. At tight end two, Mark Andrews. At 3, Sam LaPorta. At 4, Trey McBride. At 5, George Kittle. And at 6, Dalton Kincaid. This is a hell of a big tier with 6 tight ends who I think we kind of agree on this, even though we have to rank them in a certain order. They all have the ability to finish as the tight end one overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of those things. It's tough being sharp, Alfredo. You and I have been there the entire offseason when Sam LaPorta was the consensus tight end one, and we kept saying, like, wait, did you guys forget about Travis Kelce? Like, he was still the per game tight end one last year, despite playing with an injury, and Sam LaPorta with the expected touchdown regression. So we've kind of been on this for the entire offseason that Travis Kelce is still the king. Like, he's still the guy that you want to draft as the first tight end off the board. Now ADP and consensus rankings are reflecting that as well. Mark Andrews at number 2, just another guy that has done it consistently year after year after year after year. And I think Sam LaPorta could get there. Like, he, was the overall tight end one last year. Of course, the fears are that Jameson Williams takes a step forward and that his touchdown regression hits. He doesn't score 11 touchdowns this year. But at the end of the day, every guy in this tier, like you said, has a chance to finish as the overall tight end one. Trey McBride last year, on a per route run basis, he was drawing more usage than any other tight end. George Kittle, for 4 straight years, has seen his role as a pass catcher grow while still maintaining his elite efficiency. And Dalton Kincaid is kind of the forgotten guy, I think, in this tier. And it feels weird that you and I both have him all the way down at tight end 6, because realistically, like, he could be the wide receiver one on a Josh Allen led offense. He could see 150, 160 targets and finish as the overall tight end one. So we've talked about it a lot, and anybody who has watched this show throughout the offseason has heard our takes on the tight end landscape and how we feel about it. But you absolutely want to try to get one of these 6 guys. There are guys later that you can draft that have potential, but it feels like these 6, you're getting a very high floor with all 6 of them, and you're potentially drafting the overall tight end one.
So let's, out of this tier, let's talk about some guys that you think are maybe not the obvious choice, but could very well be the tight end one. I know for me, the guy that I really like to bet on this year is Trey McBride. And one, it's a lot of it is I love the college game film. Absolutely love the offense that he's in with Kyler Murray. I love that some of the attention from defense is going to be taken off of him by Marvin Harrison Jr. being drafted. And there's just a few things that I want to read off from last year with Trey McBride, where McBride led all tight ends in first downs per route run last season, which is, as we've come to know, is one of the best stats at predicting future fantasy success. Ryan Heath over at Fantasy Points, using their data suite, has talked about that a bunch, whether it's for running backs, receivers, tight ends, any type of pass catchers. The first down per route run ends up being a really, really predictive stat. He also posted the best yards per route run by a tight end younger than the age of 25 last season. It's one of the best performances from a young tight end that we have seen. On top of that, the Cardinals and Kyler Murray continue to target the tight end at a fantastic rate. Last year, Trey McBride with a 29% target share, and the Cardinals overall second in the NFL with a 33% target share to the tight end position. I'm just absolutely loving the type of volume that Trey McBride can see, and the fact that most people are willing to draft him as the tight end 4 or 5, sometimes tight end 3 as well. I love that value because it means that I can get him around later than Sam LaPorta or Mark Andrews.
I'm glad that you're bringing up Trey McBride, because I feel like all these shows that we've done over the last few days talking about quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, it's just been a bobblehead show. You and I just like, yeah, good take. And I don't disagree, but we are splitting hairs inside this tier. Like, we've said it. All these guys have very high floors, very high ceilings, but this is where the biggest divergence is in our rankings at the top of the list. I'm a little bit lower on Trey McBride. I mean, I've still got him as my tight end 5. You've got him as your tight end 3. So we're still very, very close. But I find myself passing on Trey McBride a little bit. First of all, I agree with everything you said. I think he's a great player. Big fan of him. I used to live in Fort Collins, so I got to meet him at his pro day and super nice guy. I'm rooting for him. But year one, he couldn't get out from under the shadow of Zach Ertz, which is concerning. And then even in year two, it took a Zach Ertz injury for him to become a full-time player. So what we saw last year, I mean, it's impossible to ignore how good he was in the second half of the season. And that's why I'm still ranking him as a top 5 tight end. But my fear is that now with Marvin Harrison in the picture and Greg Dortch taking a step forward, who we've seen really display a strong connection with Kyler Murray, I don't know if we're going to be seeing that same usage for Trey McBride that we saw over the second half of the season last year. So I'm still content to take him, and I've still got him in the elite tier. But for me, with his ADP typically being tight end 3, I find myself passing on Trey McBride and waiting for George Kittle a little bit later. It was only a matter of time before I mentioned Kittle's name, but he is my favorite player in this tier when you start looking at, the cost to acquire these guys.
So let's talk it out then. With Trey McBride, you're worried about the target volume. From week 10 on last year, Trey McBride was earning 8.3 targets per game.
Mhm.
Where do you think he goes down to? Are you thinking he's more along the lines of 6 or 7 targets per game?
I was going to say 6 to 6.5 targets per game, which is what I expect, and still very good. I mean, it's still probably going to give him a top 5 finish, but I just think that, with Marvin Harrison in the picture, he's going to take a huge chunk of that passing pie.
So, just for some context here, Travis Kelce, 7 targets per game last year, finished as the tight
Mhm.
end 1 in points per game. Sam LaPorta, 6.8 targets per game during that time. He finished as the tight end 2. I don't necessarily know that the Trey McBride target share is going down there. I mean, we also listen, Marvin Harrison is going to get his. I don't think that we're going to be seeing an offensive environment where both of these guys can't coexist. And even if the target volume does go down, I do think
The
the opportunity
efficiency should go
for
up.
then that's
Yeah.
exactly it. I do think the efficiency goes up. I do think for the opportunity for yards after the catch goes up because that field was going to be way more spread out. I do think this is going to be a team that will have to rely on the pass a lot more with Kyler Murray out there, and their defense still isn't quite up to par. So they could be passing more, even though the target share could go down. But we could see some better touchdowns from Trey McBride, some better efficiency. There's a lot that could go his way. Um,
Listen, I'm not
Dave,
telling you not to draft Trey McBride. That's not what I'm
yeah,
saying. That's the one spot in our top 6 where we had a little bit of a disagreement, and I was feeling frisky. I wanted to push back and argue a little bit because we've been agreeing way too much this week, and it's annoying me.
yeah, that's about right. Dave being
Speaking of
annoying.
agreements, you and I are both ahead of consensus on George Kittle. Love to see that. And would you
Why
agree
not?
with me that, like, when you look at from a cost standpoint, where George Kittle is typically getting drafted after all of these guys, like in ADP, he's going behind Kelsey, Andrews, Laporta, McBride, and Kincaid in a lot of drafts. That just means, in my opinion, George Kittle, not only in the tight end position, George Kittle is just one of the best values overall in drafts this year.
I mean, can we just talk about what he did last year? George Kittle led all tight ends in yards per route run, yards per target, yards per reception, yards per team pass attempt, EPA, and deep targets.
Yep.
This is like, what are we doing? I understand that we oftentimes we get excited about the breakouts and the guys who could be better next season. And this is not a shot at Dalton Kincaid or Kyle Pitts or anyone, but I don't quite get the reasoning for ranking George Kittle behind them, as especially since we've seen what he can do. We know that 49ers offense is going to be good. And if anything, the year could get even better for him if Brandon Ayuk is gone. Dave, I know at one point I had Kittle behind Kincaid and I've seen the light and I'm keeping Kittle firmly planted in my top 5, but I don't think George Kittle should be any lower than tight end 5 in anyone's rankings.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. And, I actually slipped up earlier when I said that he's seen his route participation grow in 4 straight years. He's actually seen it grow in 5 straight years. And I mean, it's been a huge growth. Like in 2019, George Kittle only ran a route on 70% of the passing plays for the San Francisco 49ers. And everybody said, he's a glorified blocking tight end, a glorified lineman. And, this narrative has stuck around since 2019 and 2020 when he was sub 80% route participation. But then in 2021, he jumped that 80% mark. In 2022, he hit 90%. And last year, he saw 95.3% route participation, which means he was running a route on almost every single passing play. They aren't keeping him in as a blocker the way that they did earlier in his career. And like you said, he led in so many efficiency metrics. So this is a full-time player on a very good offense who is wildly efficient. I don't understand why Kittle is sliding to where he is. Now, we've also talked about Brandon Ayuk potentially being traded, and I don't think that's going to happen. But even if Ayuk does stay in San Francisco, we see that when players sit out in camp, they have a dip in efficiency. So now we could see even more of a growing role for George Kittle. I've got him right now as my tight end 4, and it almost feels too low. Like I've got McBride ahead of him, or I'm sorry, I've got Andrews ahead of him, and I've got LaPorta ahead of him. But man, it's just like you can see the stars aligning for a top 1, top 2 finish from Kittle this year.
Yeah, and I think just as you said, that's with or without Ayuk on the team. I have Sam LaPorta as my tight end 4 and George Kittle as my tight end 5, and I think they are way closer than most people realize. And so every time I see, like right now, average draft position has George Kittle going as tight end 6 and Sam LaPorta as tight end 2. And for me, they are neck and neck as guys who can be major touchdown scorers. They can receive plenty of targets, and they're going to get a lot of route participation. So I think that kind of encompasses it's a microcosm of the tight end position this year. Dave, let's go down to our second tier. But before we do that, I want to remind everybody you got a bunch of ways you can enjoy this show on youtube.com/@footballguysfantasy. If you're watching this video currently, please give this a like, comment down below of your opinion on these tight ends, someone you think should be ranked higher, ranked lower, maybe a sleeper that you think is going to go off that you're targeting in drafts. Also drop your questions there. We try to answer as many of those as possible. And then if you are listening on the podcast, which is either on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast, please leave a 5-star review after this episode. Let us know how we're doing. Give us some feedback. Tell us about a topic you'd like to hear us talk about in the future. And, we always appreciate any type of feedback we get from our audience, as long as it's good. We
Yeah,
don't
only the good. Yeah, no, don't say anything bad. My fragile ego can't handle it.
I actually don't mind it. You know what? Leave bad comments, but make it 5 stars. 5 stars and just tell us how much we suck. I really don't care.
I still remember the review we got on Apple Podcasts like 5 months ago that said Dave Kluge is the worst fantasy takes in the industry. It's a shame that Alfredo Brown has to work with him. Lives rent free in my mind. Mark Beatty, I remember your name. I remember the review. It still hurts my soul.
I was going to say, thanks for the review, Mom. But no, okay, never mind. Someone else. All right, let's go to our next tier here. This is tier 2 with the tight ends, but it's only
this is
tight ends
oh
here.
Crap, I missed out on the top 6 tier.
Yeah. This is your like last turn. There's no bathrooms for 200 miles. This is where you're getting off and getting yourself a tight end. Kyle Pitts at 7, Evan Engram at 8. We are in lockstep on these. Each of these, we have them ranked the exact same, 7 and 8. Their average draft position, 7 and 8. I think there's a little bit more projection here with Kyle Pitts, but we obviously still know the talent is there. We know that the offense has improved. We know that he will be top 2 or 3 in targets on his team. Evan Engram, almost the same thing. Offense should be improved, should be top 2 or 3, maybe even number 1 on his team in targets. We just don't necessarily know that he is quite as talented as Kyle Pitts. But Dave, I don't really know that there's even much here to go on. This is just kind of like, hey, these are like the last guys that have a shot at finishing maybe in the top 5, right? I don't know that they can either be number 1.
I'd say they could finish number 1. I mean, we've seen Evan Engram was the tight end 2 last year, tight end 5 the year before, and Kyle Pitts, we know the profile is there. Like, I don't need to bore you with the numbers we've been boring you with for the last 4 years. 99th percentile size adjusted speed score, leading the league in air yard share, and every single year basically that he's been in the league. Like, we know he is a good player. Now he's finally on a good offense with a good quarterback. So, we kind of joked around that these are like the, oh crap, I missed out on the elite tier guys, but I think you'd feel pretty confident in either of these guys. Evan Engram is a guy that I'm slowly kind of cooling off on as we get a louder and louder drumbeat for Brian Thomas Jr. It sounds like he's going to have a huge role in the offense, and we might see the usage for Evan Engram shrink a little bit. And like you said, there's some projection here with Kyle Pitts, but Kyle Pitts is good, man. Like, he's still younger than a lot of the guys we talked about in the elite tier. He's younger than Dalton Kincaid, and Dalton Kincaid was a rookie last year. Kyle Pitts is already at the end of his rookie contract here. It's kind of crazy to think about, but Kyle
And he's
Pitts
still
like
just
hasn't even
19 years old.
I know, yeah, and hasn't even scratched the surface of his potential. So I still like these guys. Like, they're technically a tier behind the elite guys for us, but I think that you could still feel pretty good drafting either of these guys and just plugging them in, week out, not having to worry about streaming.
I joked there that Kyle Pitts is just 19 years old. He's actually 23, but it
It's
feels
crazy.
like he's been in the league forever. He's the exact same age as Sam LaPorta. He's actually a year younger than Trey McBride and Dalton Kincaid. So maybe we
Kyle
just
Pitts is our new Amari Cooper. Like where Amari Cooper got drafted so young and you'd look at it and Amari
Josh
Cooper is like
Jacobs.
24 years old going into year 6 and you're like, how does this make sense? Yeah, Kyle Pitts is the same thing.
Yeah. All right. Let's go down to tier number 3, where it gets a little bit different. You and I have a few disagreements here. At number 9, we've got Jake Ferguson. At 10, David Njoku. Oh boy. At tight end 11, Taysom. Oh darling, oh darling, oh dear, oh gorgeous, Taysom Hill. And at 12, Brock Bowers. For those of you who don't know what I'm doing, it's the Gordon Ramsay thing where it's like when he talks to the adults, he'll call him, you donkey. And then when he's got the kids on MasterChef Junior, they
Mhm.
cry or they mess up, it's, oh dear, oh dear, oh gorgeous. That's exactly what Dennis Allen does with Taysom Hill. He was glowing about Taysom Hill. You know
After
what?
shredding every other player on the team this entire offseason, and then you ask about Taysom Hill, and he's just like, "I wish I could play him at linebacker, like, the things that he can do. He's our quarterback, he's a tight end, he's a running back, like, he can do everything on the" just gushing about Taysom
What?
Hill.
Yeah. The quote was, Taysom Hill can do everything. He's more than just a wildcat quarterback. I'd play him at Sam linebacker and I'd rush him about 50% of the time. Like he's going nuts. He loves Taysom Hill. We love Taysom Hill. The funny thing is that Dennis Allen hates everyone else on his team. He is such a disapproving parent that absolutely has a favorite child, and it's Taysom Hill. And I think a lot of that goes into our ranking here. It's not just that the coach likes him, but Dave, we've talked about this a lot, and you've converted me, and you've brought me up and higher and higher and higher. And I think probably about a month ago, I was closer to like tight end 18 or 20 on Taysom Hill, and then I moved to 16 and 14, and then just I keep for some reason only jumping odd numbers. But here I am, tight end 12. You've got him at tight end 11. That puts him firmly as our tight end 11. I know there are going to be people watching us for the first time or listening to us for the first time, and they're like, okay, these guys are stupid. Why would I draft or want to have Taysom Hill on my team? You never know when to start him.
Can I
Dave,
sum it up really
that's
concisely why you
exactly
want
what I want, please.
He's been a top 10 tight end in 4 consecutive seasons. And it's not pretty. Like if you roster Taysom Hill, you know that you're getting boom weeks and then you're getting weeks where he gives you 2 or 3 points, but at the end of the season, he just somehow moonwalks into a top 10 finish year after year. And it's not pretty, but you can plug him in and you ride the highs and the lows. And the thing is, like, when tight ends aren't going to give you a lot of points. So the difference is like when Taysom Hill has his really down weeks where he's only scoring 2 or 3 points, the reality is like most other tight ends that you're playing against are only averaging 7 or 8. So it's not like his down weeks are losing your weeks. But then when he does have that 20-point boom week, most tight ends aren't doing that. So then you're getting week winning upside from Taysom Hill. And the reality is that having down weeks at the tight end position probably isn't going to lose your matchup. So with a guy like Taysom Hill, you just draft him, you embrace the volatility, you plug him in your lineup week in and week out, and you're probably going to end the season with the top 10 tight end.
Dave, I want to go over this with you. How many times Taysom Hill finished as a top 12 tight end last year?
Mhm.
You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 finishes inside the top 12, 9 finishes inside the top 15. There are not many tight ends that you know can give you at least 9 finishes in the top 15. And on top of that, give you week winning upside. Not just, oh, he was a good tight end. I'm talking 22 fantasy points because he's getting carries out of the backfield, or 18 fantasy points. There's not a lot of tight ends in this range that are doing that, which is why I think it's appropriate that we've got him right here in this tier with Jake Ferguson, David Njoku, and Brock Bowers, the rookie. Um,
But
there's a
here's the
lot of
other thing is
expectation for him.
ADP on most websites is like tight end 25. So
Yeah.
we've got him ranked here, but you don't have to draft Taysom Hill before Brock Bowers and Pat Freiermuth and Dallas Goedert and TJ Hockenson. You can wait until the final round of your draft, pick him up for free and plug him in. And I think Taysom Hill is like a great guy too if you end up with TJ Hockenson. Taysom Hill is kind of a great bridge to get you through the early weeks until TJ Hockenson returns. Um, yeah, I mean, spreading the gospel of Taysom Hill. Like the guy is just out here every single year with this weird kind of hybrid role. I want to say as well, we know that he's a tight end on Sleeper. Yahoo just changed his eligibility. So if you're playing on Yahoo, he is now a tight end again after years of being just a quarterback. So that's the huge caveat here. Like Taysom Hill, if you're plugging him in as a quarterback, you're not getting the production that you want because the reality is, Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold are going to outscore him as quarterbacks. But when you're comparing him to Gerald Everett and Tyler Conklin and these other late round tight ends, you're getting so much more upside with Taysom Hill.
Man, I'm looking at it, and there's really, when you look at the season as a whole, I know you might take a few L's here and there with Taysom Hill if you put him at tight end and just fill in the roster, but you end up winning more games than you'll
Right.
lose, excuse me, by putting Taysom Hill at tight end. The upside is incredible. And at this point, there is no difference between him and a Dallas Goedert, a Dalton Schultz, a Hunter Henry, Pat Freiermuth, all these other guys that come later. You just have to be willing to live with the ups and downs. And I think that's just the nature of the tight end position, anyways. I don't think that most people live in drafts by saying, if I can get just a good solid 8 to 10 points from my tight end, I'll be happy. That's not going to win you your weeks. And that's what you end up looking for, which is why people go to tight end streamers and they're looking for guys that can get them 12 to 15 points in a week. Well, you've got that with Taysom Hill, and you've got it for free. And like you said, Dave, he's basically finishing as a top 12 tight end every single year.
Yeah. And Alfredo, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show before, but I did finish as ECR's
Oh,
number 2
God.
ranker last year. I'm just gonna
No one cares.
pat myself on the back. I know I never
No
mention
one
it. I,
cares.
I don't like I don't like to gloat, but people ask me all the
Boom.
time. They're like, "How did you do that last year? Like, what was your trick?" And I don't know if I'm going to be able to recreate it because my trick last year was being the only person that had Taysom Hill inside the top 10 tight ends, and that really helped my accuracy scoring at the end of the year. Now I think people are catching on to a little bit. You look at where he is getting ranked, and he is much higher in a lot of the sharp rankers draft rankings.
I want to ask you a question here. Jake Ferguson, I've got him as my tight end 9. Dave, you've got him as tight end 10.
You love him
Last
and I
season,
hate him.
yeah, that's exactly what it is. Love hate. Last season, 102 targets, and this was a guy who, at the beginning of the season, we were people, not me. I was actually super high. I remember that last year in our episode with
Yeah,
Jamie
yeah.
Eisenberg, where Jake Ferguson. It felt like weird to be so in on him, but it worked out. Um, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, but he's going to be splitting targets with Luke Schoonmaker or Schoonmaker." Don't even know how to say it. That's how little of an impact he made on the season. But Jake Ferguson here, his 100 targets he saw last season. The Cowboys could be pressed to pass even more. Their defense could be worse. Their offense doesn't have a strong running game. Could they actually be passing more and giving Jake Ferguson more targets? Is this a guy that maybe he and Njoku belong in the next tier up with Pitts and Engram?
Yeah, I don't think you could put them in that tier because, like I said, we've seen Ingram with back-to-back seasons as a top 5 tight end already, so he deserves to be comfortably ahead of these guys. Kyle Pitts has a profile every year that he's been in the league where we know that he draws targets at an elite rate and that he can do things that other tight ends can't do. So I think we should have Ferguson and Njoku in a tier below, but I'm okay drafting either of these guys. The reason I just prefer Njoku ever so slightly is we know athleticism is really what makes or breaks an NFL tight end. And Jake Ferguson, I think he's a sharp route runner. He's good at contested catches, and that's why he gets a lot of usage near the red zone. But you just start looking at the athletic profile for David Njoku and Jake Ferguson, and it just couldn't be a wider gap between the two. I mean, David Njoku is just a freak by every single metric: size, speed, strength, burst, everything. Jake Ferguson isn't. So I think that, here, if you're swinging for upside, I'll admit that I think Jake Ferguson is probably a slightly safer player because we saw the target volume last year. We know that he's probably going to be second or third on the team in targets. David Njoku, though, has a much higher ceiling, where if his role that we saw over the second half of the season, admittedly without Deshaun Watson, but if we could see him maintain that usage with Deshaun Watson or maybe even Jameis Winston, whoever it is they're playing quarterback in Cleveland, if David Njoku can see his role grow, he has the athleticism to crack into that elite tier. And I don't think there's anything Jake Ferguson could do to ever really crack into that elite tier.
I'll say this. Last year, from weeks 8 to 18, all the way through to the end of the season, Jake Ferguson was the tight end 7 in fantasy points per game ahead of Dalton Kincaid, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, a bunch of other guys that we really like. But I will say this, David Njoku, tight end 1. As you
Yeah.
said, it was not with Deshaun Watson, though. And it was also not with Jerry Jeudy. And I think that's a name that I almost sometimes forget he's even on the Browns. And maybe it won't matter whatsoever, Dave. But how much are you letting that play into the thought process here with David Njoku? That yes, it is Deshaun Watson back again, and now there is another receiver out there catching passes. I think that's what continues to keep me leaving David Njoku at tight end 10 firmly. I have not moved him up nor moved him down. He has stayed there all calendar year for me.
Yeah, I just, like I said, I think that David Njoku is just a better athlete, and
Okay.
athleticism is what's so important to tight ends. It took a few years for him to get there. We knew with the first round draft capital, the size adjusted speed score, the relative athletic score, all these things. We knew that Njoku could potentially be very good, but it was just a slow burn. It took him a while to get there, but I'm a believer. We'll talk about this later when we get to Isaiah Likely, who I am very, very high on later in the draft or later in our rankings as well. I'm just a believer in the whole cat's out of the bag narrative. Like when you see a player go out there and just dominating. I mean, what he was doing after the catch when they'd get the ball in his hands, nobody could stop him. Like he looked like Mike Allstott in the open field, just trucking through defenders. I don't think that they're just going to say like, "Hey, we finally unlocked this guy," but Deshaun Watson doesn't like tight ends, so now we're going to focus on Jerry Jeudy. I think that they are going to try to do their best to find creative ways to get David Njoku the ball. The one thing throughout his career that's been frustrating is his slot alignment. Like he plays less than 50% of his snaps out of the slot. He plays primarily in line. And when you look at all of the other guys, Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews and these guys that are way at the top of our rankings, they play the majority of their snaps out of the slot. So we did see him lining up more in the slot and less in line in the second half of the season. That could have just been because Nick Chubb was out and Deshaun Watson was out and they needed to spread the offense out for Joe Flacco. But I'm just a believer that the cat is out of the bag. They finally unlocked David Njoku, and I don't think that they're just going to put him back on the shelf in 2024.
The slot versus inline thing is something that does worry me a bit. We've talked about how the Browns are planning on moving a bit more to a 3 wide receiver set, having Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore out on the field, and they keep drafting receivers every single year. They've got guys like Cedric Tillman and David Bell and Jamari
Those are our
Thrasher
names.
this year. They're names, right? Like I'm not saying those guys are. And but like quick before the people in the comments like, what an idiot! They're not stopping David Njoku. No, that's not the point. That's not the point I'm making. I'm saying they continue to add more receivers to this roster because they want to be able to throw as many of them out there as possible in sort of a spread offense, which is what Deshaun Watson has really liked throughout his career. So the worry that you have about him not playing in the slot, David Njoku, I keep that worry because it's not just that they added a receiver, it's how they might line up David Njoku going forward. Before we go to our next tier, Dave, last guy I want to talk about here, Brock Bowers. And we're spending a lot more time on these top 12 because, quite frankly, in a 12 team league, you're drafting 12 tight ends. Like maybe you're drafting an extra one. So we're going to spend a little more time with these guys. Brock Bowers, a lot of this is going to be projection. A lot of this now we know at least who the starting quarterback is, Gardner Minshew. We know he can support at least one very talented receiver. And my assumption is that will be Devontae Adams, who is getting the targets from Gardner Minshew. Brock Bowers, it seems like the team wants to use him in a bunch of creative ways, whether that is doing the Taysom Hill thing, taking runs out of the backfield on jet sweeps, getting screens. There's been a lot of really interesting usage for Brock Bowers. And I think a lot of that just, it was kind of shown in how they drafted him. They drafted him quite early in the first round. They want to use him. Where are you at with Brock Bowers? Because you actually have him outside of your top 12. What's the reasoning for that? You have him behind TJ Hockenson, who will actually be missing time early in the season.
I thought like early in the offseason, I was higher on Brock Bowers than most. And I said that like we're seeing tight ends getting up to NFL speed quicker. And we saw it last year with LaPorta and Kincaid making immediate contributions to the offense. And we saw Kyle Pitts just a few years ago go for 1,000 yards his rookie season. And I was higher on Brock Bowers than most in the spring and summer, but like you said, we start getting these reports out of camp that like he's getting end rounds and he's getting rushes between the tackles and he's lining up in the slot and he's doing all the fun things that we want to see from tight ends. And now he has moved up, and now I'm somehow behind on Brock Bowers, and I don't want to be because he's a great prospect, and I think that he could be good, but if we're drafting him already, close to inside the top 10, like you said, he's going as the tight end 11. It's just tough for me to see a situation where he could outperform that price tag, where he's on an offense where we want Gardner Minshew to be the quarterback, I think. But we don't
Yeah.
feel great about Gardner Minshew. We don't feel great about Aiden O'Connell. Devontae Adams is there. He's going to pull a 30+% target share. Jacoby Myers is there, who every single year pulls a 25-ish% target share. So there's not a ton left for Brock Bowers. And I understand the excitement about the creative usage and things like that. But like, what are we hoping for? Like, if everything lines up right for Brock Bowers, you're getting Taysom Hill production, which you can get for free at the end of your draft. I'll just take Taysom Hill instead of Brock Bowers.
Oh, that's not nice. That's not nice.
I want to say Brock Bowers, like long term in Dynasty, I think he deserves to be inside the top 5. It's hard to press against that, but you start looking at the projections for 2024, and I just don't see a path with Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers there where Brock Bowers is going to do much more than like maybe tight end 8 production.
Well, I see that we could have Brock Bowers being, let's say, someone like rookie year Kyle Pitts, who was tight end 7. Like, I think that is very much in the realm of possibility for Brock Bowers. He's likely going to be top 2 on his team in targets. You talk about wanting to have players that aren't just lining up in line. Bowers is doing that. You talk about wanting to have players that are phenomenal athletes. We know he is that. I know we don't want to take too much away from preseason, Dave, but we've got some data here from Adam Levitan, who's a great follow on Twitter. He mentions the usage for Brock Bowers in the preseason game, and the Raiders were using a lot of 2 tight end sets where Brock Bowers was in the field for every single one of those. He lined up 5 times in line out of his 11 plays, excuse me. Out of his 11 plays, he lined up 5 times in line, 3 times in the backfield, 2 times out wide, and 1 time in the slot. Wow. Brock Bowers is going to be doing
All
a
over
lot.
the place.
He's going to be doing a lot. And to me, you talk about how the cat's out of the bag for a guy like David Njoku, who's just super athletic, and the team's going to want to get him the ball. I mean, the cat's been out of the bag for Brock Bowers. We've known that he's this phenomenal player. This is why they drafted him so early. And it seems like they're already making the effort to get him the ball, which is why I'm willing to comfortably put him in the top 12, just because I think once we start to move down, there's a lot of ifs and maybes. And it's obviously like right now we're just splitting hairs. I have him at 11. You have him at 13. It's not crazy. But I just want to talk about why I'm a little bit higher on Bowers.
I think the out for Bowers, and I've mentioned it a few times over the last couple of weeks, is that I still expect Devontae Adams to get traded at some point this season. And if Devontae Adams leaves Las Vegas, then we're looking at a
Oh,
top 5 ceiling
mama.
for Brock Bowers. But it's going to be tough for him to get there with Devontae Adams dominating target share the way that he does.
Yeah, 100%. Let's go down to our next tier, and we'll be a little bit quicker with these as, you're likely not drafting some of these guys. I think this tier still has some good value in it. So tier number 4. At 13, we've got Pat Freiermuth. 14, Dallas Goedert. 15, TJ Hockenson. 16, Dalton Schultz. 17, Luke Musgrave. And at 18, Hunter Henry. Dave, you and I were not too far apart on a lot of these. I'd say we're maybe 2 spots apart on a couple of them. I think we have guys like Freiermuth and Hockenson a little flip-flop. For example, TJ Hockenson is your tight end 12. So I actually just want to start out with that because that's probably the biggest name in this tier. Hockenson is a guy who might not be back until mid to late October if everything goes well. And even once he gets onto the field, there might be a bit of a ramp-up process. We do know, however, it's likely going to be Sam Darnold who is starting for the Vikings throughout the season, unless things go terribly, terribly awry, which in that case, we probably don't want TJ Hockenson anyways. But what keeps TJ Hockenson so high for you in your rankings? I know that once he's on the field, man, he's super talented. He's going to be getting the targets. But how do you deal with a guy that could miss like half of the year or not give you full production for half or more of the season?
I'm buying the injury discount. I mean, the thesis for TJ Hockenson is very similar to the thesis with Jonathan Brooks. Like, you're not going to be getting any production in the first half of the season, most likely. But anything he gives you ahead of week 8 is just kind of a cherry on top. You're drafting TJ Hockenson for the second half of the season. And that's kind of where my head is at. We still saw last year with Nick Mullins, like it wasn't quite as good as what we saw with Kirk Cousins. But if you look in the handful of games that they play together, 8 targets and 7 targets, and then he got injured, in the first half of the next game, pulling 4 targets. But the target volume was still there. He was averaging 7.5 targets per game, so it's not like he's going to be dead in the water without Kirk Cousins there. And this is one of those where I upload 2 sets of rankings, and I kind of make that joke often on Harris podcast. I've got intro music when I come on the show where one of his listeners wrote a song about how I have 2 sets of rankings to win the contest. And that's it. On Fantasy Pros, I'm going to be much lower on TJ Hockenson because we're projecting him to play half the season. On Football Guys, where I put my actual rankings, not my projections, I'm going to be much higher on TJ Hockenson because we know the second half of the season, those games carry so much more weight. Like if you can draft TJ Hockenson and just throw him on your IR slot and not even think about him for the first 8 weeks and then plug him in and you're potentially getting top 5 production down the stretch and through the playoffs, that makes him a player that I want to target pretty aggressively. So, when you start looking at projections, yeah, I'm going to put Pat Freiermuth and Brock Bowers and Taysom Hill and all these guys ahead of TJ Hockenson. But when I'm in a draft and I'm drafting based on rankings, I want to draft TJ Hockenson ahead of those guys because I know that I'm potentially getting a league winning tight end for very, very cheap in my drafts.
Dave, if you can't put TJ Hockenson on IR, if you don't have an IR spot, are you still ranking him this high and just using up a bench spot for him there?
It depends how deep benches are. If I'm in a league that only has 5 bench spots, I'm probably less apt to draft a guy like TJ Hockenson. But if I've got deep benches or an IR spot, I'd say the cutoff for me would be like 7+ bench spots. If I've got that, I'm probably drafting TJ Hockenson. But then I might try to get really creative and try to pair him up with a guy who has a late bye week so I don't have to worry about ever rostering 3 tight ends. I want to make sure that I can have a guy that I can kind of rely on to get me through the early weeks until TJ Hockenson returns. But yeah, if I can stash TJ Hockenson, I mean, we know like this guy was great when he was in Detroit, moved to Minnesota and saw this huge breakout with Kirk Cousins. But even with Nick Mullins, he was still drawing the target volume that makes him so appealing that, yeah, I mean, if I've got 7+ bench spots, if I've got an IR spot, I'm trying to draft TJ Hockenson and stash him for the second half of the year.
So I don't know that it's necessarily fair to compare him directly to Jonathan Brooks, whereas Jonathan Brooks, he's been in camp and we kind of have the confirmation that it's just going to be the first few weeks for Brooks and he'll be back in. For Hockenson, when you look at the Minnesota Vikings schedule, it kind of seems like he'll be back after the bye week, which would be week 7,
Yeah.
October 20th. And that's also kind of hoping that he's at 100%. So you might be getting an 80 to 90% Hockenson for week 7, week 8, right? Like you maybe start to get a full TJ Hockenson by week 9, week 10, week 11. I know those are the weeks that matter most in fantasy football. If I don't have an IR spot, it's kind of hard to justify that. It's kind of hard. I mean, maybe. I guess it all depends, like what you said, with the deep benches or IR spots. But I think that's what makes me put him. And by the way, like once again, we are splitting hairs with the tight end position. I have him at tight end 15. You have him at tight end 12. Like it's not that crazy. I just would prefer if I can get a guy that is going to play the full season. Let's go back here to the top of this tier. Yeah, go. You want to say something?
Yeah, it's just I mean, if there's no right or wrong answer, it's
There's
just how
not.
you like to play the game. But like,
Right.
if I was getting a guy, TJ Hockenson has basically been giving us like 13 to 15 points per game over the last couple of seasons. And for me, like, if my options are a guy who's going to give me 14 points per game from week 10 onward and 0 for the first half of the season, or a guy who's going to give me 8 or 9 points per game for the entirety of the season, I want the guy who's going to give me that elite production in the second half of the
Oh
season, and
yeah.
I'll just patch together what I can for the first half.
If I have an IR spot, absolutely. What I don't want to do is if I don't have a deep bench is have a guy on my team that's just taking up space, especially if I don't have to pay all that much for a guy like Brock Bowers or Taysom Hill or David Njoku, right? Like if I'm doing it comparatively, I just maybe rather have one of those guys than waste a bench spot. That's the only thing for me. If I have the IR spot, I'm happy taking TJ Hockenson wherever because I
Yeah.
think the payoff at the end is so much better. My ranking here of having him at tight end 15 is a bit more of the projection of where he finishes on the end of the season, most likely as tight end 15, as opposed to what he can give you in those final 8 weeks of the season.
So my actionable spin that I will say, and this is what I've been doing in so many drafts. If I miss out on the top 8, which that cutoff point for us, George Kittle, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts,
Yep.
Evan Engram. If I miss out on those guys, you know, every once in a while I'll sprinkle in a David Njoku or Brock Bowers or Jake Ferguson just in case. But my favorite thing to do is just to wait until rounds 14, 15, 16, whatever it is,
Yep.
draft TJ Hockenson and then draft Taysom Hill. And
Love it.
I feel pretty good with that duo. If I've got deep benches or if I've got an IR spot, I am okay trotting out a Taysom Hill for the first half of the season and TJ Hockenson for the second half.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, Yahoo has just made Taysom Hill a tight end in their leagues, and Sleeper has Taysom Hill as a tight end in their leagues. And if you're drafting, I know that your league mates are going to laugh at you. Haha, you drafted the guy that's injured, TJ Hawkinson, or haha, you drafted Taysom Hill. Good luck starting him. You're going to end up one way or another with a top 10 tight end on that team. That's just what we're looking at here.
I'm
And
excited for
you
the comments on these discussions because this is just like they're repulsive takes. They really are. Like drafting a guy coming off an ACL with Sam Darnold at his quarterback, and then drafting a utility Swiss knife guy in Taysom Hill. But it's a game about numbers, and the numbers are there for both of these guys, whether it's pretty or not. You know, these are the late round guys that you want to target.
They're not repulsive takes, Dave. You have beautiful takes. They're
Well, that's what I'm
lovely.
saying. The comments are going to be fun because a lot of people there's a lot of depth to this conversation, and it's you know a lot of people are going to disagree with us, and they're going to disagree with us staunchly. So I'm excited to hear the discourse on this conversation.
Really quick, something random that's just happened here. Breaking news in the middle of the show. Jahan Dotson has been traded to the Philadelphia
Oh,
Eagles.
I saw that a while ago. This is a tight end show.
I know, but like
Uh,
let's give people 30 seconds of it. Does this do anything for you in terms of Terry McLaurin's target share? Or maybe one of the tight ends on the Commanders, like Zach Ertz, Ben Sinnott? Does this change anything for you in that passing game?
my boiled down take on this trade is that teams don't trade good players inside their division.
Okay, but I mean, teams also draft players in the first round, and there's all that.
Yeah.
Like, there's like
I
there's
just think if the Commanders thought that Jahan Dotson was good, why would they give him to a division rival? I think that Jahan Dotson is cooked, unfortunately.
Commanders could also just be really bad at evaluating talent. I think like there's multiple things there. You're also not answering my question. I said, what does it do for the current pass catchers on the Washington Commanders offense? And you proceeded to say Jahan Dotson's cooked. What about Terry McLaurin?
What I
What about
did,
Ben Sinnott?
I moved the one thing that I made in my rankings change when I saw that Jahan Dotson moved down for me a little bit, but I did move Pat Freiermuth ahead of Dallas Goedert. That's the only actionable thing that changed for me with this trade.
Is it Diami Brown time? No. All right, let's move on. Let's move on.
Yeah.
Next tight end I want to talk about here. Pat Freiermuth is a guy, I've got him ranked at tight end 13. You've got him at 15. He comes out to be tight end 13 overall in our consensus rankings here. But he's tied with a few of these guys here, Goddard, Hockenson. Can we trust Arthur Smith again? Can it happen? The tight ends were targeted at the highest rate on the Atlanta Falcons offense last year of any team in the league. We
Yep.
know Arthur Smith runs 2 tight end sets more than anybody. We know that Pat Freiermuth can be a top 10 tight end when he
Mhm.
simply has a decent quarterback and he can be healthy. So what's the real upside with Freiermuth? Or are we just drafting him to be a safe tight end because then we know the usage is there? Or is there legitimate upside where we're saying Pat Freiermuth was the steal of my draft at the tight end position?
I think he certainly can be. I'm a big fan of Pat Freiermuth. You know, this isn't just like a guy. This is a guy who was a second round pick and, you know, looked really good in his first 2 years and then was injured most of year three. And I think people forgot about it. The reason I'm a little bit more bullish on Pat Freiermuth, and both of us are pretty bullish on Pat Freiermuth. Both of us are ahead of ADP on him. Like you said, these Arthur Smith offenses run through their tight ends. Now, we expect that to be Pat Freiermuth, and last year we expected that to be Kyle Pitts. So the worst case scenario here is that we see these Arthur Smith shenanigans, and we expect Pat Freiermuth to be the guy there, and we end up seeing a heavy dose of Darnell Washington and Connor Hayward and Michael Pruitt, who followed him from Atlanta. And we did see that a lot last year, where we thought Kyle Pitts was going to be the guy, and then McCole Pruitt was the first tight end to catch a touchdown in Atlanta last year. And then Jonnu Smith is ripping off 80-yard plays on these beautifully designed screen passes. And we're like, why isn't this going to Kyle Pitts? That's the downside with Pat Freiermuth, is like we expect him to be heavily involved, but it might be really frustrating when Darnell Washington becomes their preferred guy in the red zone.
Yeah, there's a small part of me that says I want no part of anybody on the Steelers offense.
Yeah.
And I think it's not fully reflected, but somewhat reflected in my tight end 13 ranking. I'd just rather not draft Pat Freiermuth if I don't have to. But if I missed out on guys, like, sure, I'm willing to take him. I think there's enough touchdown upside there that he can win me some weeks, and there's enough of a floor with volume and usage that he won't lose me my weeks. So I'm happy with where he is, but it is the most ham and cheese sandwich tight end choice you could make in your fantasy drafts. Ham and cheese is fine. It'd be a little bland at times. It'll satisfy you, but it's not always going to be the best of the best. And that's kind of where I am with him. Dave, really quickly before we move on, I just want to give a quick shout out. I really like Luke Musgrave this year.
Yeah.
There's a lot that can go on in that Packers offense. I love young tight ends that can play out of the slot, that have athleticism, and that do not have an established wide receiver one just yet, or at least a one that we know of here before the season. That Packers offense could be really good. Tucker Kraft is coming off of an injury where he had a torn pec. That usually takes a bit more time for him to get back out into the field. He is practicing, but we don't know if he's going to be at full strength. So Luke Musgrave is a guy that I think just an interesting guy to take a flyer on.
Yeah,
Let's
like
move
in
to
best ball leagues where you have to draft multiple tight ends, Luke Musgrave is one of my most drafted tight ends. Absolutely love him at that cost as a potential tight end too. But let's be honest. I mean, like in
you're not
most
drafting.
leagues, people aren't drafting. Like maybe half of the teams in your draft are drafting a tight end too. So this is kind of the cutoff point. Like the reality is that on in most fantasy football leagues, Luke Musgrave, Hunter Henry, the guys that we're going to talk about in this next tier are probably going to be on waivers. And you might have one guy that like really falls in love with a late round tight end and drafts him, but you probably don't need a second tight end unless you're drafting a TJ Hockenson or unless you're drafting Brock Bowers and you have concerns about how he's going to acclimate in his rookie season. Usually you're okay just drafting one tight end.
So you talk about tight ends that are likely going to be on waivers. Can probably guarantee the rest of the tight ends on this next tier are going to be on waivers. At 19, we've got Tyler Conklin. I knew we were going to do it. This is just a glorious day. Tyler Conklin at 20, Jonnu Smith, 21.
You are ahead of ADP on Tyler Conklin. I cannot believe what I'm seeing.
I just hate all the other tight ends, man. Like they're
I
not.
cannot believe
good.
you are ahead of ADP on Tyler Conklin. This is wow.
There's a lot to like. He's a very likable player.
You have Tyler Conklin ahead of Jonnu Smith.
Yeah, why not? Let's go nuts.
Ooh.
It's the tight end 19 and 21, man. I mean this with all due respect to all of us making fantasy content. Who cares? Gosh.
Not believe what my eyes are seeing.
Hey, man, Tyler Conklin could be the second highest target earner on that Jets offense. Well, no, third. He'll be third behind Garrett and Brees. It could happen. It could happen.
It could.
Jonnu Smith.
It could.
Jonnu Smith is also could be third on the team in targets. Probably fourth behind Devon Achane. We'll see. So Tyler, back to this. Tyler Conklin, 19. Jonnu Smith, 20. Cade Otton, 21. Isaiah Likely, 22. Juwan Johnson, 23. And Cole Kmet at 24. And Dave hates Cole Kmet. He's got him at tight end 27. Basically, he just shouldn't even be in the NFL at this point, if you ask Dave.
Come on.
All right.
I mean, he's going to be the fourth option on his team. Yeah. And Cole Kmet, like, still very young. This is one of those, this is obviously a redraft show, but Cole Kmet in Dynasty, I still want him. Like, he just turned 25 years old. He's on a long-term deal. Like, they gave him a second contract. He's going to be tied to Caleb Williams for the next 5 years. Keenan Allen's probably out of the picture after this year. And then we could see Cole Kmet grow a little bit, but just the numbers tell us that he's probably going to be fourth on the team in targets. And the fourth option for a rookie quarterback isn't somebody who's typically going to give us a lot of production.
Yeah, not excited about Cole Kmet. I got him ranked as tight end 20 because honestly just don't know what to do once you get to that point. It's hard to not still see him as a talented player and as a guy that can earn targets. Because that's, I
Yeah.
mean, one thing we can always go back to is just talented players earn targets regardless of where they are in the pecking order or how good or bad the offense is. Like we see that all the time. And frankly, Cade Otton's probably third or fourth on his team in targets, and I don't think he's as talented as Cole Kmet. Like there's the reasonings behind these rankings here. But
Yeah.
Dave, let's just pick one. Each of us pick one tight end out of this group that we like as a sleeper at their
Can I
draft
can
cost.
I please do two? Please.
Oh my god, if you just find you do two, and I'm gonna do zero because we're running out of time. Go.
Jonnu Smith and Isaiah Likely. And honestly, where I'm at, like I have these guys ranked just behind Dalton Schultz and Hunter Henry, and but the reality is, like, I'd prefer Jonnu Smith or Isaiah Likely, and the reason I have some of these other boring guys like Hunter Henry ahead of him is because we're playing a projections game, and Hunter Henry projects to get more targets and projects to get more points, but the range of outcomes for Jonnu Smith, a speedster that does so much after the catch in this Miami Dolphins offense, the ceiling for him is sky high if everything comes together in Miami. Then Isaiah Likely, much like the thesis that I have with David Njoku, cat's out of the bag. They're not just going to say Isaiah Likely, thanks for all you did in the second half of last season, but you're going to be watching from the bench now. I think that we see the Baltimore Ravens start implementing more two tight end sets, and we saw Isaiah Likely can play inline, he can play out wide, he can play in the slot. I think we're going to see him and Mark Andrews on the field together a lot. So, yeah, like there's technically some guys that I have ranked ahead of these guys because we're playing that numbers projection game. But Jonnu Smith and Isaiah Likely, I have no qualms with taking them at the very end of your draft just because the potential ceiling is so high.
I do. Don't take two tight ends in your drafts. There you go. That's your actionable advice. By the way, I just want to throw this out there, just a little sprinkle of something. The Commanders did get a third round pick back in the exchange for Jahan Dotson, and I know you're going to say your thing that they don't you don't trade good players. What if all this is just to keep adding to a potential deal to get Brandon Ayuk on the Commanders?
Could be.
Hey
But it
now,
wasn't a third round pick for Jahan Dotson. It was Jahan
yeah.
Dotson in a fifth for a third and a seventh.
Oh my
So
God,
I don't
whatever. They have a
I just want to
third
say
now. I'm just saying
I'm
it's
just saying
part of the.
they're not valuing Jahan Dotson as a third round
Okay,
pick.
I'm not
Yeah.
talking
They
about
moved him.
Jahan Dotson. Stop doing this. I'm not talking about Jahan Dotson. I'm just saying they now have another
I
wide receiver spot open and they have an extra third round pick laying around.
yeah.
They could make that trade.
I
This is
would
something
love
that has
to
been
see
talked about.
Ayuk in Washington over Pittsburgh.
I think it just kills his value, honestly. I'd drop him down my rankings quite a bit.
I like that we spent about 5 minutes on the tight end show talking about Jahan Dotson and Brandon Ayuk, keeping it on
No,
brand
you
with
spent
the
time talking about Jahan
tangents.
Dotson. You
I
spent.
want to talk about Jonnu Smith and Isaiah
I know you
Likely,
do.
and you want to
I know
talk
you
about Brandon Ayuk on our tight end show.
One of these things is a lot more entertaining. I'm just going to say that. All right. We've done it. We've gone through 24 tight ends here. It's way too many tiers for tight ends. Please don't
I thought
draft
this was going to be
someone.
a 20-minute episode. How did we
I
stretch
thought
tight
so
ends
too.
to 55 minutes? What
We
happened?
we pulled the radio thing where we just filled time with just nonsense. But if you
Uh,
have watched or listened all the way through, thank you as always. You guys are the absolute best audience in the world. We are every single time overwhelmed by the support we get from all of you football guys out there. We want to thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. We are really excited for the season to start. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, please do so and make sure you are subscribed to the daily news update here from Football Guys, where you get everything that you need for training camp news, preseason news, injury updates, all that sent directly to your email inbox from Joe Bryant himself. Dave, yesterday I missed out on saying adios on the live recording, so I'm going to say it twice
I
today.
added it to the podcast. I don't know if
It's
you saw.
okay. That's
I
that.
cut it
That's
from an old show. I just I couldn't. It was so weird. Like the show ended, and I was just like, where am I? Like
it's.
this wasn't our sign off.
I ruined everybody's day, so I'll do two today. All right, here we
Thank
go.
you.
All right,
Restore
for my
balance in the universe.
for myself, for Dave Kluge, I want to thank you guys for watching and listening all the way through. We'll see you next time. Adios. Adios.